We are 2.5 degrees above the equator, and anytime I set the sails, another rain shower pops up to upset the flow of air. And so that means I have to reset the sails or just roll them up and get them out of the way. It's becoming frustrating. We have a rain shower there. We have a rain shower there. Over there. A rain shower there. We are surrounded by rain showers. And we haven't gotten a speck of rain on our boat yet. So I've kind of given up sailing for a while. It's only about 10 knots of wind anyway. At least wind, we aren't affected by the rain showers. So we've got the motor running. We've got just the stay sail up to give us a little stability, help to keep us from rolling. And of course, when there is wind, it's right on the nose. But this is sailing into the tropics. I can't imagine what the old guys back in the 1800s did with their sailing ships trying to deal with this. But we have lots of diesel, so hopefully what we're trying to do now is get west as possible. So right now we're sailing southwest because we have terrible currents that's going to be shoving us to the east. And so we want to get as far west as we can, then head south to the Maldives, and then those currents can do whatever they want with us. Head us back to the east, but we'll have our westing already. Okay, the wind has picked up to 13, 14 knots, and we're doing 6.6 over the ground. So what a surprise that is. I think it's time to put the Monitor self-steering vane into action. Going 6 knots, it makes it a little more difficult for dropping the paddle into the water and getting it latched. So I have to get a good drop on it and then pull forward a bit with the line, and it's snagged. There's a latch down on the bottom that this red line is attached to, and that locks it in place. But if we hit an obstruction, it'll allow the paddle to swing to an up position without breaking everything. We'll turn the air vane into the wind so it's standing straight up and down like that. Perfect. And then I'm going to get ready to put autopilot in standby and turn this knob to lock it into one of the holes, and the Monitor is steering the boat. And if the wind should shift around to the right, the boat will follow that wind shift around to the right. And same if the wind should shift off to the port. So an old line had worn on a pulley and eventually broke. I should have been more vigilant and adjusted the line so the pulley would wear on a new section of line to extend its life. I get these control lines from Monitor. They are special, low stretch and strong, and last thousands of miles. The new line is stiff enough to shove down the pulley chase, and by continually lifting and jamming it down, eventually it finds its way out the bottom, where it can then be threaded through the hole on the paddle arm and finished with a stopper knot. A trucker's hitch finishes the replacement installation. This is the port side jib lead block, and if you look closely, you'll see a hole on the forward end of it. That's where the fixed pin used to be, the spring-loaded pin. I got rid of that long ago. And when we are set up with the 90% jib, it is permanently shackled to the sliding pin that holds it in the most forward position on that track. Now when we switch to the 120% jib, I need to be able to move that block forward and aft very easily from the cockpit, depending on how we have the 120 furled. So we set up a simple block and tackle and have this arrangement with the red line going all the way back to the cockpit. Now, no matter how much of the 120 we have deployed or how little, we can position the block very easily from the cockpit. And that red line goes back to a brake in the cockpit to hold everything secure. There are times when, since there are no roller bearings on this block, it can be a little difficult to maneuver, so I just reach over the side of the coaming and pull up on the red line and sweat the line, just like if I'm pulling back on a bow and arrow, and that will help to bring the block forward. Just the natural tension of the sheet and the angle will pull the block backwards on its own. You can spend hundreds of dollars on a new block with all kinds of roller bearings or ball bearings that will slide extremely easy forward and aft, but this is a good, quick, cheap situation, and it works well enough for me. I don't need anything more fancy than this, and it's far safer than going out on the deck and trying to struggle with the pin block to reset it in a new position, especially in rough weather. So without a block and tackle set up on the jib car so it can be adjusted from the cockpit, this is the only other way that I know of to adjust a car that's under load. But first you have to tie a line to the jib sheet as close to the clew as possible using a rolling hitch, and then bring that down to a cleat on deck to give it some aft pull. Then you have to go all the way back to the winch, ease off the jib sheet, then go forward and move the car back, then go back to the cockpit, take up tension on the jib sheet on the winch, and then you can go forward again and untie the rolling hitch. And that can be difficult because there's a lot of pressure, and sometimes it takes a screwdriver or something to start prying up the line so you can untie the rolling hitch and undo that temporary securing line. If anybody knows another system for moving a jib car under load, hey, please leave the information in the comments below. Thank you. Oh, I hate that luffing. Very hard on the sails. Temporary line off. Sometimes the pressures are so great on this that I need a screwdriver to loosen it up. Done.
Roger, roger. All is well, all is well. We've gone 18 miles since I talked to you this morning. 18 miles since we talked to you this morning towards Chagos.
The storm that was shown on PredictWind before we left Trincomalee, Sri Lanka, upset the whole weather pattern. So rather than having flat calms, we had winds, if we had winds at all, was directly on the nose, and at times it got to be maybe 20 knots of wind. So we're tacking north, we're tacking south, we're tacking in just about every direction that we can possibly tack, except in the direction that we want to go to the southwest. Of course, it couldn't happen during the day. It had to happen at 1 o'clock in the morning, middle of the night, and the engines just started to cough and slow down as though it had something on the prop. So we stopped the engine. I went over the side with an underwater light, and there was nothing on the prop. The next thing was then to start the engine again and go down into the engine room. So I went into the engine room with the engine running, and I could not believe what I saw on the Racor suction gauge. It was higher than I've ever seen it before. Initially 11 years before, when we had some contaminants in the tank, it went up to, you know, just maybe the 1130 position, but never over here at the 930 position. The suction gauge rotates counterclockwise from the 12 o'clock position where the dark square spot is. The needle is always in the 12 o'clock position on the black mark, meaning that there's no restriction in the fuel system at all. So we had a severe restriction somewhere in the fuel system before the engine. So I switched the selector switch from the left filter to the right filter, and the suction stayed the same. This was really becoming a mystery. So we shut down the engine, and I opened the starboard side Racor filter. That's the one on our left as you're looking at it, and I could not believe how black and contaminated it was. The port side filter was actually very clean, but that's the one we really don't use very often. And it turned out, to make a long story short, both fuel pickups in both tanks were restricted at the pickup. So I had to disconnect the fuel line from the tank to the Racor filter and blow hard. First in the port tank, which I was blowing so hard I almost gave up on it, but then finally it did clear. And then switched the fuel selector switches over to the starboard tank and did the same thing. Blew like crazy and blew the restriction back in. And that cleared it, and that got us going again, along with adding a new filter to the starboard side. I always add biocide. I mean, that's a real necessity. Even though you might be burning through a lot of fuel, I think my big mistake was we spent so much time in Southeast Asia in very calm water, in marinas or in anchorages. For about a year there, I did not add the biocide, and that was all to my detriment. So a lot of the contaminants that were growing, the algae that was growing, settled to the bottom, and then this rough passage shook everything up, and it quickly got sucked into the fuel pickups. There's at least 2 other boats that we know of had this exact same problem on their passage, and they had to go through the same procedure to blow out the restrictions to get their engines running again. So I cannot speak highly enough about the importance of having a suction gauge and dual Racor filters. Without that suction gauge, it would have taken me a lot longer to solve this fuel restriction mystery. Right away I knew there was a problem, and pretty much just where it was. The closer we got to the equator, the more difficult the sailing was because of the very strong currents. You can see the yellow on this current chart, and it's all flowing very strongly east. But at least that was some help to us, because we knew just how long we had to stay in those miserable currents that were pushing us away from our destination, and then how far south we had to go to get in some counter currents that would help push us towards Chagos. I don't know where else to get this information other than through PredictWind. I used to do a lot of boat deliveries between New England and the Caribbean, and I always had all kinds of sources for currents between New England and Bermuda to play the Gulf Stream currents and all of those eddies. But out here in the big Indian Ocean, I'm at a big loss, and no other cruiser that I've been able to contact has been able to give me where to get up-to-date, present, current information for this part of the Indian Ocean. So PredictWind, whatever we pay for it on a monthly basis, it has more than paid for itself just on this one passage. It's more than just wind, it's also these currents, which are equally important. But anyway, we finally made it to Chagos. We were having a great time in the islands, and we want to spend every day of our 30 days allotted here. Well, I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, please click down below on the thumbs up and on the subscribe button, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot for watching.